it's a delight, I guess, for us to have Cesi Cruz presenting here today. There are many, many reasons why we are excited and we have very high expectations, Cesi, about this presentation. For many reasons. Well, first, she is from McGill. She did her BA and MA at McGill. Secondly, she is presenting fascinating research, and we'll see that in a minute or two. Thirdly, she is truly interdisciplinary, basically teaching in both economics and political science, and integrating sociology, because she's very interested in social networks. And fourth, doing experimental research, which many of us are really, really interested in. So that's all of this is wonderful. And on top of this, she's presenting a paper about electoral promises, electoral pledges. And this is a very special topic for many of us in the center, because it reminds us of François Pétry, who passed away, a colleague that we respected a lot, that did a lot of rigorous work on electoral pledges, was very concerned about doing policy relevant research. And we'll see, I guess, today that electoral promises are meaningful and important. So I think this is with this very special thought for François, who was a wonderful researcher, a wonderful human being, interested in doing high quality research, but also socially relevant research. So this is a special honor for him, I think. So Cesi, we're forward to getting your presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. And it's an honor to be able to speak to Francois' legacy in this way. And it's a real pleasure for me to be able to come back home to Montreal to share my work with my lovely co-authors, Phil Kiefer, Julian Lebon, and Francesco Trevi. And the broader research agenda is really motivated by a central problem that's at this intersection of political science, economics, and sociology. The idea that in many parts of the world, campaigning on policy platforms or public goods provision simply isn't a good strategy for winning elections. As one mayor in a municipality in the Philippines once told me, he said, "Look, Cesi, if I could win elections by building schools and fixing roads, don't you think that I would do it?" Right? And if you think about it, he's got a good point there. And so what we like to focus on with this particular research agenda is the idea that there are features of the political environment in both developed and developing countries that can make it difficult for politicians to make policy promises and then to follow through with them to begin with, right? And that's, for us, one of the things, those policy difficulties that we're focusing on is the fact that voters often don't have enough good quality information to be able to hold their politicians accountable. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to present the results of 2 field experiments that are intended to use information campaigns to level this accountability playing field between voters and politicians. But we have even more ambitious aims as well, to go beyond the sort of stereotypes of unsophisticated or stupid voters, to understand how voters respond to campaign information and how they integrate policy information with their own assessments of candidate performance. And this is all with a view towards designing interventions to change the fundamental way that voters evaluate politicians in these different contexts. And I just want to check you guys are seeing my slides, right? Okay. So what we do is that we implement a set of information campaigns in consecutive real-world elections in the Philippines that are intended to enable voters to evaluate candidates on both policy and valence or performance dimensions. And we start with a structural model to inform the research design and supplement the experimental evidence, which basically allows us to consider both things like the salience of policies or voter beliefs about policies separately from their policy preferences. And that's something that's a feature that's absent in a lot of models of voter behavior more broadly. And then second, what this allows us to do is that we can also handle other dimensions of vote choice besides policies and candidate qualities. So we factor in things like vote buying and clientelism that are features of politics in many parts of the world. And the last is that we allow the policy space to be multidimensional. So we can essentially get a realistic assessment of policy preferences that are separate from related or things that are hard to pull apart, like party affiliation or other considerations. But before I get into all of this, there are some things that you need to know about Philippine politics before any of this will make sense. And even then, maybe it won't make sense. But so here we have the first thing you need to know is that parties are very weak in the Philippines. So there's no equivalent to Democrats and Republicans in the US, for example. And that mostly they're known for personalities rather than policy positions. And so, for example, here's a picture of a standard campaign poster that was used by all the candidates in the region that we were working in. And what they have is, I don't know if you guys will recognize her, but that's Imelda Marcos, the one who's famous for all the shoes. And she's front and center with each of the candidates. And then if you see tiny, in the corner, there's the party logo and name. So it's basically, you can't even read the party name and logo. And the poster is just all about the personality. And then second, campaigns typically don't have any policy content. In fact, you're much more likely to see candidates singing and dancing than you are seeing them articulating policy positions at rallies. And so here, this is a picture of Senator Bong Revilla at one of his rallies, and he's engaging in just about the most typical rally activity there is. See here, right, the little envelope that he has in his hand? He is handing out money to voters. And while, I don't want to shock all my Americanist and Canadian politics friends, that is actually illegal. They're just not supposed to be doing that. But you can see that it's done so openly because the laws prohibiting it are rarely enforced. And it's like many other, and it happens in a form that's very similar to other countries in Latin America with clientelism and sort of brokers with extensive local knowledge to make sure that they can identify the right voters for vote buying and make sure that they're keeping their end of the bargain. And so vote buying is a much more prominent part of campaigns than policy positions and things like that. And then last, speaking of vote buying being done openly, here's a picture of a poster that the very enterprising Daday has put up advertising her family's vote for sale. And that 2,500 pesos for congressman, for example, it's about $50. And that's about 5 times the minimum wage. These are very, substantial amounts. There's quite some money to be made on election day. And so savvy voters like Daday are doing quite well for themselves on elections, right? But beyond, using this picture to illustrate that vote buying is done quite openly to the point that they're advertising, votes for sale, I do want to draw your attention to one feature of that this highlights that runs counter to the idea that somehow voters are unsophisticated or uninformed. And that's these amounts for concejal. If you can see them, the amounts for concejal, Daday has put 2 different amounts down. And that's because concejal is done by approval voting, where you can put up to 3 names, but you can put, put 1, 2, or 3 names. And Daday is so clever that she realizes that putting only 1 name is more valuable than being 1 name out of 3. And so she charges a different price if you want to be the only name she puts down versus if you're happy to be 1 out of 3. And for us, like, this idea is that, seeing these things against a backdrop of or a narrative of voters being unsophisticated really didn't make sense to us, right? That we see that voters are, very, very sophisticated. And so that was part of what prompted this whole project. And one advantage to working in the Philippines is that the decentralized political context gives us lots of local elections that we can run these experiments in. And these are elections that actually matter because municipalities and mayors in particular control a large chunk of the municipal budget and have with very little oversight. And so when we talk about their policies and policy positions, it's actually something that they can follow through on and it would make sense in that context. And so what we're starting out with is a very simple model of a mayoral race between 2 candidates. And what we expect is that voters would care about, 2 general things, right? The voters care about public goods, like where, how the mayor would allocate the budget. Are they going to build schools? Are they going to fix roads? And they also care about this idea of valence or for the candidate, Jay. And here we mean it in a very general political economy sense of these candidate qualities. Things like honesty or whether candidates are perceived to be competent would all fit into this. And then, because this is the Philippines, of course, we have an additional thing that we don't often see in these types of models in the developed world, and that's before the election, candidates can pay money to the voters in the form of vote buying. And then, of course, we expect that after the election, the elected mayor has an opportunity to implement her preferred policies. And then what this means is that really what we're looking at is determinants we're trying to think about what the determinants of voter behavior are. And so we break this down. I have it here in as the equation for simplicity, but also just very simply in English. Essentially what we're looking at is the idea of vote choice being determined by one feature being vote buying from the candidate to the voter, the other being the voter's perception of the valence of that candidate. And then we have the policy, but policy is a little different because here it's not just that there are some policies that are universally better or universally worse, but rather what we're looking at is a distance between what the candidate is proposing and then what the voters actually want, right? And so that's why we have that where we're looking at similarity or distance between the policies rather than just policies on their own. And then what we're going to do is we're going to estimate all of these parameters and look at how our experiment changes the way that voters put weight on all these different factors. And then what we do in terms of, so how we translate that into a field experiment is that together with an NGO in the Philippines, we collected data from candidates on how they would allocate these resources across 10 different sectors. This is what I mean about multidimensional. And because you can imagine that this is a difficult task, what we did is we had a picture worksheet with different sectors. So, like we had health, education, agriculture, and then we gave them a stack of 20 poker chips that represented the budget. And then that way they could sort of physically allocate the poker chips across the worksheet to show what kind of emphasis they would place on the different sectors. And what's nice is that the candidates took this task very seriously. They often moved their allocations around. They were thinking quite a bit about the poker chips. And in fact, I think that was the point that I realized that in some ways we were doing a little bit of a candidate or politician education campaign as well, right? One of the mayors that we were serving, he looked at me at one point and says, Ceci, I never thought about, if I spend more on health, that means I have to spend less on something else. And I'm thinking, you're a third-term mayor, and this is the first time you've thought about budgetary trade-offs. So there was a lot of sort of this sort of dynamic and back and forth of thinking about these budgets. And then we use this information to produce flyers, just like the one I'm going to show you in a second. And then we distributed these flyers to all in person to every single household in randomly selected treatment villages within each municipality. And so note that each municipality would have a different flyer, but then all of the villages within a municipality would get the same flyer about their candidates. And then we repeated the experiment in 2016 with a key difference. Because we already had the flyers from 2013, we could essentially have two treatment groups, right? The first is analogous to our 2013 experiment, in that they got a flyer with just the current candidates' promises and policies. But for the second treatment group, we actually gave them two flyers. We gave them the flyer with the promises of their current candidate, but we also gave them the previous flyer with the promises of the candidates that ran in 2013, which by definition included the promises of their incumbent mayor. Right? And so here's a picture of the flyers. This is the front of the flyers. And essentially what it says is that, did you know that the municipal government and your mayor has these funds that they can allocate to different areas? And then the back of the flyer just says a little bit about our NGO partner, which is the Parish Pastoral Council for Responsible Voting, which is the largest voter education NGO in the Philippines. And so here's the inside of the flyer, and here's where you'll see why we needed to do these, hand out the flyers in person. It's because they're complicated, and we wanted to make sure that enumerators were trained to be able to explain what the content was. For example, we wanted to make sure that voters didn't accidentally think we were somehow rating candidates. Like this isn't a report card where we're grading the different candidates. So we wanted to make sure to explain that these allocations came directly from the candidates themselves. And so here, for example, you'll see that these are the allocations for the municipality of Burgos in 2016. And Riolita Balbalan's allocations are shown in blue, and Cornelio Carta's allocations are shown in red. And so you'll see here that Cornelio Carta has, 15% of this budget he's allocating to health and education, while Riolita Balbalan is not allocating anything to those sectors, but instead putting quite a bit of her budget on direct assistance to the needy. Right? And so the idea is that these flyers can help voters see their candidates head to head on policy preferences. And then at the bottom, these are the specific policy promises that candidates wanted to convey. And here they were allowed to have up to 3 that they could convey to voters. And so what this means for the experiment is that we started with 158 villages across the municipalities, and we matched them in triplets. And essentially what we did is within each triplet, one village gets randomly assigned to be the control. The other gets randomly assigned to receive just the 2016 flyer, which is their current candidates. And then the other village would get both the 2016 and the 2013 flyer. And so what we think this is doing is that it's providing 3 different types of information, right? So the control group, they get no information. They just they get the same thing that they would always get. The first treatment, they have information that allows them to compare their 2016 candidates. And in that second treatment group, they have information not only to compare their 2016 candidates, but they can also evaluate whether their incumbent kept her promises from 2013. So it's important to note that we don't actually tell them to do this. We don't instruct them to, oh, by the way, here's the flyer and you can see whether that mayor kept her promises. All we do is we tell them that this, by the way, this is the same flyer except for the 2013 election. So the idea there is not to be a overly intrusive treatment, and that we are just giving the voters the information that they need to be able to do these evaluations, but it's up to them if they do it or not. Right? So I want to stop for a second, just because, if anybody has any questions. I'm not the best at keeping track of the chat. No, we're okay? But feel free to interrupt me. I'm joint appointed in an econ department, so it'll just make me feel at home. It won't bother me at all, I promise. And so let me talk a little bit about the data. As I mentioned before, we gave flyers to all the households in the treatment villages. But for the N-line survey, we took just a random sample of 22 households per village. And essentially what we're doing is we're collecting data on the basic household characteristics. But we also had the voters conduct the same exercise with the poker chips and the policies to get a sense of what their policy preferences were. And we combined the survey data with actual precinct level results on turnout and vote share for all of the candidates. And at the end of the day, what we get is for the reduced form part of the paper, we have these regressions where the dependent variable is whether the individual I in village V in triplet L reported voting for the incumbent in the 2016 elections. And here are the main variable we're interested in is that delta similarity variable. And that's just a difference in overlap of the policies and preferences for the voter versus for the nearest challenger, right? So how close are you to the incumbent relative to how close you were to all of the other, to the nearest challenger. And then we cluster the standard errors at the village level. And so essentially this similarity variable has have all how we calculate it, but I think essentially the way to think about it is that it would be large if the voter is much more similar to the incumbent than the challenger. And then it would be small if the voter were equally distant or close to both, right? So it's this idea where, we start from the starting point that these politicians would have different policy preferences, and essentially we just want to see which of the politicians the voter is closer to, right? And because we weren't actually sure what would matter, and this, we're starting from, we're in a context where policies don't matter at all. And so we measure similarity in several different ways. One way is that we look at all 10 sectors, right? Maybe all those matters, but maybe only the top three sectors for the voters matters. If I put most of my chips on health, education, and agriculture, maybe I only care about those differences. And then we also look at the top 3 sectors overall for all voters, which happen to be health, education, and agriculture. And so what we find is that, what we find is that as a result of the intervention, treated voters are much more knowledgeable and less uncertain about policy promises. And we also see effects on both policy and valence dimensions, in that voters are more likely to vote for the candidate whose current proposed policies are closest to their own preferences. So these are voters in the treatment group. And additionally, in that second treatment group, remember that there was a second group of voters that got 2 flyers? Those voters are more likely to vote for the incumbent when they perceive that the incumbent fulfilled her promises. And then from the structural estimation, what we can show is that we're seeing that these effects are coming at the expense of vote buying, right? So the treatment increased the weight that voters are placing on policy, and conversely decreased the weight that they're placing on vote buying as a determinant of vote choice. And I can show you here the results visually. So here's you can see that a treatment that informs voters of candidate policies, and that these voters are more likely to vote for candidates when those current policy promises are closest to their own preferences, right? So just having the information on its own isn't doing anything. What really matters is if you get the information and you're closer to the incumbent, and that's where you see increased voting for the incumbent. And you can see it here in the table as well. And essentially what this means is that a 1 standard deviation increase in that similarity measure, the similarity of voter preferences with the incumbent promises, increases the likelihood of voting for the incumbent by 3 to 4 percentage points, which is quite big if you think about things like vote margins, right? And then here, additionally, if you recall, we have, because of that second treatment group that has both the flyers for 2016 and 2013, we can see that one interesting thing that only they do, and that's rewarding incumbents who keep previous promises. And that to us is a really big thing, because to them, they not only did they had to incorporate all these new policy information that they're getting from the flyers, but they had to make their own assessment of whether they think that the incumbents kept promises or not. Because we didn't give that information, right? All we gave was the promises, but we didn't say anything about whether we thought those promises were kept or not. So this is just voters on their own using information that they have. And here's the table for that. And the way that we measure kept promises is that we asked voters per village what all the different projects were that were being done in their villages, and then we coded those by sector. And so, for example, if you're in a village and everybody reports that there was a new well and a new school, then those would be under the sectors of water and sanitation and education, right? And essentially, we just match those to see whether the politicians were indeed allocating the budget from the standpoint of that village in the sectors that they suggest. And what's really interesting about these results is that, at first, being a little cynical, I thought that maybe it was just about how many projects a village had. But this result holds even when we're controlling for just total number of projects that the village had. So, that matters too, of course. People like getting more money than less money. But beyond getting more money than less money, voters also cared a lot about politicians actually having kept promises. And so we do a number of mechanism tests and robustness checks just to make sure that, the story makes sense. Because like I said, there's this very unusual type of clientelistic environment, and we wanted to make sure that all the little pieces of the story held up as well. So one thing we find is that that was completely consistent with how we are thinking about vote choice in this environment is that the effects are weaker for voters with clientelistic ties to one of the candidates, right? And this makes sense. If I'm the mayor's brother-in-law, then it doesn't really matter to me what kind of policies everybody is promising, right? So if I'm Jared Kushner, then I like Trump even if, no matter what his policies are. And second, the other thing we wanted to do is make sure that the treatment group that we gave the 2 flyers to, that these effects are really operating on valence dimensions, right? There was not something else that was strange going on, like maybe just too much information that was making them react differently. And so what we find with the survey data is that voters who were reminded of those past promises are also more likely to rate the incumbents that fulfill them as being more honest and more capable, right? So this is sort of consistent with the story that they were interpreting the information in that way indeed. And third, and perhaps our biggest concern, is whether voters were just matching their policy preferences to the candidates that they liked already. And here, ideally, I think the ideal solution is for me to get a time machine and go back and do a baseline survey. But absent time machines, what we did is what we looked at the determinants of policy preferences, right? And what we find is that there's really no evidence that the individual policy preferences and the process that determines the policy preferences are affected by our treatments. So, for example, you can imagine that that households that make most of their income by farming would have preferences for agricultural services, and then maybe families with children, school-age children, might have preferences for education. And so all of those things are, in fact, determinants of preferences, but they're identical. The determinants of preferences are the same in the treatment and the control households, right? We also do, I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A, but we do this also a number of different ways, like looking at, because where incumbents are more popular, to see if preferences tend to match incumbents more in the treated villages in those municipalities, but we don't find any evidence that that's the case either. And then last, we also show that our results hold even when we're controlling for vote buying, right? And again, that's something that happens about a little 30% of the respondents reported that they were offered money for their vote. And then moving on, just a little bit about I'm not going to spend too much time, but a little bit about the structural part of our paper. One of the great takeaways is that we're able to essentially look at these different parameters and get a sense of not only the distribution of voter beliefs, and the degree of learning, but also like how voters are sort of using the information and incorporating the information in their vote choice. And what we find from the structural part is that salience plays a role that's independent of beliefs. So our intervention made the policies more salient as well. And then once it's salient, then voters were sort of assessing and comparing their policies to the politicians. We also find that it's very consistent with the reduced form results, that belief distributions were tighter. And so this is just indicating that the voters were sort of learning, they were taking in the information in the same way that we find in the reduced form. We also do a couple of counterfactual exercises that I won't go into here, but I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A. But for me, one of the really fun things about this structural estimation that we get is that it helps us answer a puzzle that sort of arises once you get to get results like this. And that's, why don't candidates provide this policy information themselves if it helps, right? Because on the one hand, the policy appeals are effective, right? If you remember that one standard deviation increase in policy similarity can yield, quite an additional vote share. And yet we don't see policy appeals being used in any kind of strategic way in these campaigns. Right? And so we do a really simple back of the envelope cost benefit analysis. And I have to say, having done econ at McGill, if they had told me that one day I could use cost benefit analysis to calculate the value of vote buying in a campaign, I would have paid much closer attention and been more excited. But assuming that candidates can target an information treatment. So here's the other part, is that we have to have this sort of heroic assumption. Because if you think about it, money is nice for everybody, but a policy appeal only works if I also like the policies that you're telling me about. Right. So, if I'm not interested in agriculture and you're telling me about agricultural policies you're going to do, it's not really going to help. Right. And so But then we're thinking, well, the candidates are good enough at targeting voters for vote buying that they have a good sense of which voters will keep their promises and which won't. So why don't we go ahead and assume that candidates can micro-target their information treatment exactly to those voters whose policy interests are aligned, right? So we assume that that politicians know their voters well, and that's probably reasonable in places like the Philippines. And so even then, what we find is that if you treat 100 households at $5 per flyer, and these are figures that we have and we verified with politicians, you only get about 16 votes, right? And by contrast, when if you think about the per vote cost of vote buying, it's $50 per household, and usually there's about 4 people per household, so the votes come out relatively cheap in that framework, right? And again, this isn't, like I said, it's just a sort of fun exercise that we were doing. You can imagine a number of different ways you could make the policy treatment cheaper, right? You can go around with a megaphone and yell your policies. You can also imagine ways that vote buying could possibly be more expensive in the sense of accounting for the monitoring costs and building the infrastructure and the relationships. So, we're not looking at this as sort of some definitive exact thing to say that, this is why we don't see policy appeals emerging, but rather we see it in a very optimistic way, right? Like in the sense that delta isn't very far, right? You can imagine maybe some role for NGOs or media to be able to step in and provide these types of information treatments without necessarily having it have to come from candidates themselves. Right? But this is just to show a sort of an illustrative way to show why, even though policies might matter, individual candidates might not necessarily have the sort of economic incentives or strategic incentives to pursue that as their campaign policies. Although we reported, our politicians from the same region reported to us that they were actually seeing flyers in the previous election. So I don't know, maybe after seeing flyers for 2 elections in a row, that they're starting to do it on their own. And so just to close, we build on previous experimental research that has attempted to address these informational deficiencies by using a new field experiment in which we're trying to provide voters with information that can allow them to evaluate candidates both on policy and valence dimensions. And what we find is that even in this really clientelistic political context, that information campaigns can help voters use information in rational and actually very sophisticated ways. And while we still see that vote buying is a much more sort of cost-effective strategy for politicians, we're also quite optimistic in the sense that our work suggests a possible role for media or non-government organizations to provide this kind of policy information, even absent politician incentives to do so. And so we also used our results to inform the design of new field experiments that we conducted in the most recent election, in which we partnered with political parties to randomize their policy messaging in order to explore how adding emotional campaign content can affect or distort the rational use of information by voters. And so that is it for me now. Thank you very much for your attention.
I think there are questions from Ditlin and Samara for the time being. And Samara, Ditlin first.
Thank you, Cesi. That was fantastic. Really super interesting, innovative experiment, and on so many different levels. And I learned a lot from it. I have 2 questions, I think. So one question was why you decided to randomize the treatments on the village level and not at the household level, because I assume that it is kind of a nested design in the sense that you do have regional candidates, so there is some variation. It's not always the same candidates, and so that there could be other local effects coming in as well, at the village level. That you then need to control out, and so it's you kind of adding a complicated layer here, I think, in your design. And I was just wondering about why that was necessary. and or whether there was a certain logic behind it. And my second question is about whether you have also tested turnout itself, not just where the vote is going, which you obviously must have asked in a questionnaire or in a follow-up interview, but also whether the turnout at all is affected by getting this information. But I think maybe the village level treatment is more complicated there, because also villages maybe vary in distances, maybe even in literacy rates also. I'm not sure if that's an issue. Yeah, anyway, so I just throw this out. I have many more questions, but I think I don't want to be too dominant here in the question.
No worries. No, that's actually a great question. And in fact, for the 2019 experiments, we're looking at emotions interacting with policies. We did that at the individual level, precisely for the reasons that you suggest. But the problem with this particular experiment, why we had to do it at the village level, is because we were treating, also sort of the idea of treating people with these flyers is that in the Philippines, everybody knows each other in villages. And so, you know, even, it's hard to treat one household and not the other. So they could show the flyer. And in fact, in a lot of places we would go, people would put the flyers up like a, you know, like they were so, yeah, like in the Philippines, people put up calendars that politicians will give, but we would see like, you know, their calendars, they would have like a Virgin Mary, Jesus Christ type of visual, and then they would have our flyer right there.
So they help you with the treatment.
Exactly. Exactly. And so our big concern was spillover effects in the sense. And so we treated entire villages precisely because we worried that people would be sharing the flyers, talking to each other about the flyers. But absolutely, I think it would have also saved us a lot of money if we could do it at the individual level, like we did for the current experiments. And then your question on turnout, absolutely, there's some sort of suggestive evidence. It's not particularly strong evidence, but I don't think it's because it didn't affect turnout. I think it's just because turnout in the Philippines is already really high. It's like at 80% in a lot of these villages. Very rarely would dip down below 70%. So really very, very high rates of turnout. Partly because they make a lot of money with going to vote and getting various goodies. And so I think there was just simply too little room to move for us to be able to observe.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Samara.
Thank you. This was so interesting. I'm so happy to have gotten the chance to see this work. Honestly, the only good thing that has come of the pandemic, I think, is the opportunity to see this kind of stuff. My only question, and I apologize if you covered this, do you take into account whether or not the person or the respondent agreed with those particular promises or what their attitudes were toward the promises? Because, you know, some of the promises they might have liked to see go by the wayside, depending on what they were.
That's a really good point. And what we thought about it in a couple of different ways. And essentially, one aspect of it was whether or not the promises matched up with their own preferences. So that's our main similarity measure. But what's interesting is that if we break down, you know, the very first set of results that I showed you guys, the treatment effects are actually weaker for the second treatment group. And when we were looking at, wait a minute, why is that the case? Why would the treatment effects be weaker just overall for policy preferences? And it was driven by the places where incumbents weren't perceived to have kept their promises. And essentially that makes sense, right? So if you are, you know, somebody is promising me a new irrigation system, but I know this guy is a liar, and so I'm just not gonna take into account those promises in my vote choice. And so that's where we really see that interaction between both the effect of, you know, they're being able, so they do take in the information and they learn about the promises just as much as the other treatment groups, just that they don't take it into account in those areas where mayors haven't been keeping their promises. By contrast, in the areas where mayors were sort of keeping promises before, then we see results that look just like treatment one with the similarity measure. So I do think that the voters are much more sophisticated, right? Like in the same way that I think American voters sort of discount, you know, hear Trump say something and then it's like their automatic discount that the promise is going to get kept. And so I think it's something similar operating in this way as well.
Right. It sort of reminds me of a sort of funny anecdote, I guess, but how Trump was touting the fact that he did not cut Social Security. And in fact, he tried to several times, but Congress wouldn't let him. So it's sort of like a strange thing to brag about. But anyway, thank you. That clarifies things. And it's a really, really cool project.
Thank you.
Thank you. Semra.
Hi, Ceci. This was a very good presentation, as usual. I really, really liked it. I have a few questions. First, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the similarity measure. How did you, I just want to understand exactly how you measured similarity policies. Can you address that, and then I'll follow up?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. So when we had that exercise where we had politicians allocating a budget across the worksheet with 10 different sectors, we also had voters do the same type of thing. And if you can imagine that those policy preferences are vectors, a very simple way of thinking about similarity would be just the, how the sort of geometric distance between the two vectors. And then we looked at the similarity that they have with the incumbent compared to how similar the next runner-up was, or the challenger was. And the reason we do that is because we wanted to downweight those places where incumbents and challengers had very similar policies, so we don't get a lot of leverage out of. But as it turned out, that wasn't too common, so we were still able to sort of see some differences between the two. The trickier thing for us is that we actually weren't sure what dimensions of policy similarity would matter, right? I think there was not a whole lot of guidance in the literature with how we should think about this. And so that's why we calculated several different ways. We look at similarity just on the things that the voter cares about. We look at similarity across all 10 sectors. We look at similarity across just the things that most voters cared about. And what we find is that those are all pretty much the same in the, even though there's theoretical differences with how we would get to those, empirically they all behave quite similarly.
Okay, because I was going to ask precisely that, which is that you can imagine similarity being measured in different ways. And if you had looked at, different measurements of it and see if the results were robust to that. And I guess you did. Now, my understanding is you did use real politicians. So they were not fictitious. So a research, this is probably not, it's not your research question, but it's something that I'm quite interested in. And I think that maybe if you have enough observations, it's possible to look at. But I wonder if you did consider, or had you looked at whether there was a gender difference. So if is it because you don't have women politicians, or is that the issue? Okay. So I assume
even just in the incumbents, I think there was one female mayor. It's very, very sad, but I would have loved to. And I think your intuition is exactly correct, that these things would be gendered, like how women representing their policy platforms, or the way that they interpret things like whether they think the women kept their promises or not, or how much credit they gave their female politicians. No, I think there would be a gendered effect. But I think like maybe we'll have to have people in the U.S. study it where there's more female politicians.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to ask that because it's a research question that I'm fascinated about recently, and wondered if you had the data, what the results would have looked, especially with promise keeping in terms of the representation literature. But that's all.
Would love to.
Thank you. Custom?
Thank you for an amazing presentation, and it was a great research design. And so I think in a way what you present here is just great news for, accountability. But I'm wondering whether this translates beyond just local elections, and how this goes to national elections, parliamentary elections. And I'm asking this because maybe there's a fundamental difference between the kind of policies you can just do at local level versus national level. Maybe just there's more complexity. Maybe it's easier to explain at a local level. And something similarly is whether we expect a certain kind of difference between I don't know the size of the villages, but just bigger cities or something like that. Is accountability functioning in a different way in this kind of just very tight and well-connected communities versus just bigger communities.
No, that's a really great point. You know, one of the things that is a nice advantage for us with the Philippines is that because it's fiscally decentralized, that most sort of client-facing type of government functions are provided by municipalities, which would not necessarily be the case in many other countries. Because for us, the tricky thing was, you know, where do we find politicians that would even have a policy platform, right? Enough of them that we could randomize that would have a policy platform and would be able to keep the promises on, or claim credit for the promises that they're keeping. For example, in the US, you know, I think the hard part for this is like, well, you know, is it really that your congressmen didn't keep their promise, or was it just because there were bigger dynamics in Congress that made it difficult for that to happen? And so here, what's nice is that we're able to sort of isolate those effects by looking at these municipalities. I would imagine that it would translate to the national level with some caveats, and that's at the national level. There is more of a sense of party. They're not always programmatic, but they're like, you know, they're parties that are associated with a person, for example. And it's less there, it's more about popularity contests. And like we have this very famous boxer, Manny Pacquiao, so he's a huge following. And he's talking about running for president. And so so at that level, there's the popularity contest aspect of it that's a little farther from the very clientelistic type of dynamics that we're seeing. So I think that would be the biggest difference. And then similarly with urban rural, that's actually really interesting. We chose rural because we thought this would be a harder test of our theory, in the sense that, you know, these places are, these are places where people are all connected and they have these strong clientelistic ties and very strong social networks. And actually even our choice of region, we chose essentially the hometown of Ferdinand Marcos and the Marcos clan. So we were like, if we can get policies to matter in this super clientelistic and corrupt place, then I think we can have a little bit more comfort level about it mattering elsewhere. And then the nice thing about, I think for me, so before all this, I have to admit, I wasn't necessarily drinking the structural estimation Kool-Aid. But one thing where I think it really is nice with experiments is that we can run these counterfactual analyses to think about, well, what happens if there were parties, or what happens if candidates could do the optimal policy position, or what happens if there were no vote buying. And so we did some of those to get a sense of, you know, how these effects would change in different contexts. So, you know, it's like, well, if you can't do vote buying, what happens to all these different things? And so for us, it's a nice balance between being able to pin down relationships at a very micro level, but then trying to speak a little broader to see about how these things might work across countries as well. And then the other thing to my advantage, I think that it's quite unfortunate, is that the U.S. is starting to resemble the Philippines more and more. So even if I feel like I might not have to travel very far to do field work anymore. I'm going to start doing experiments with Sam. I think that's my new plan.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Arnaud, do you have a question? Yes.
Hello. Yeah, actually, I had, but the question was actually answered previously. That's why I raised my hand and then I did. Thank you. But I have another question that you mentioned here. First, thank you very much for the talk. It was really, really interesting. So the point, the other question I had was actually exactly on the structural estimation, and apparently you've done something. Which, I mean, the interest is to be able to get the counterfactuals, at least in part of my view. And I was interested by your conclusion that you say, well, the politicians do not provide information because actually it's cheaper to buy the votes directly with money. And I was thinking, basically, if in the, I wanted to ask you if you had done a counterfactual, and apparently you said you did. So where there is no vote buying at all, and basically what would be then the cost of buying votes through information in that case? Will it be much cheaper. And in particular, are they stuck in a bad equilibrium where, because of the vote buying, actually you continue buying votes directly?
That's a great question, and I think I included it here about our. I might have maybe. No, that's more choice. But anyway, we did have one that maybe I'm just not finding. But essentially, what we're looking at is how one of the exercises that we did is we were trying to figure out like how expensive this monitoring have to be, or how difficult the logistics of vote buying have to be before it would no longer make sense as a strategy. And essentially the short version of it is that what we find that it to be able to for vote buying to be a bad strategy in terms of cost effectiveness, that the monitoring requirements have to be unrealistically high. Like essentially that people would take money and then not vote for the candidate, right? Something that's quite rare. So if that happens, I think I wish I had we had a cute little chart that I could show you, but I'm not remembering off the top of my head where I had put it. But essentially, like for vote buying not to work, you need unrealistic levels of non-compliance with the vote buying agreements. The other interesting thing you mentioned, the counterfactuals, I think one of my favorite one is what happens when politicians choose the optimal policy, right? Like you can think about, those like graphs that they have on median voter theory, right? Like what if they pick the exact, best policy that they can for the voters? But what's funny is that actually doesn't change much because the incumbents and challengers were quite close already, right? And so it's really striking to me that essentially, if you look at some of those, sort of look at ideal points across the sectors, like you'll see voters in the middle and then incumbents on one side and challengers right on the other side, almost like out of a textbook, right, on median voter theory. And so that was something we found was interesting.
Is it because really they are close, or is it because the utility function, basically the indifference curve, is relatively flat at the top?
That's a good point. And we did worry that maybe there's some mechanical effects because, we had 20 of the coins, and that maybe there was some, in some places you could imagine people might feel almost like mechanically to put at least one in each sector, for example. Mm-hmm. But it does look like, we're hoping to do something a little more complex with the policy preferences to really get at that. But it's a pattern that we see even in, if you look at sector by sector, like what, for water, for example, they want 40%, the incumbent will want 50, and then the challenger will want 30. It's like, really striking. And goes along with the idea that these politicians know these voters really well. And in the Philippines, is something like maybe 2/3 of voters will be just one social distance, one connection away from the mayor. So a big chunk of them, maybe like 20%, will know the mayor personally. Like to me, I don't know who my mayor is, right? And I'm not friends with him or anything like that. But there's such close social distances in these contexts that. Even though I was surprised, now it kind of makes sense that they would know their constituents quite well.
Thank you. Elisa?
Hello, this is a very interesting talk. I had just a question about the measurement that was used for keeping promises. Because from what you had said in this very quickly, it had sounded like it was self-reported based on what the different people in the village had thought had happened, which in a way makes it essentially a post-treatment measure, because the village already had a flyer from the year before that told them what the promises were. So I was wondering if you went back and cross-validated that with what you saw when you were walking around the villages, or if there's any baseline differences between villages that, what people thought had been happening in villages that weren't treated.
No, this is excellent. Oh, yes, sir, go ahead.
Oh, no, just like, are people more likely to keep the promises knowing they were being monitored? And if so, and if they weren't, why do you think the monitoring didn't have an effect?
That's a great point. For us, we actually measured this keeping promises thing a couple of different ways, and at first we were looking at a like a factual measure, right? Like we could go and look at the municipality budgets and where they spent, like where all the roads were built by village. So you can imagine that promise keeping would vary by village. Like some villages might not get a road. So we can actually do a factual version of this to look at if, objectively speaking, promises were kept or not. But the measure that we chose to use is actually the village level perception. And the reason we thought that was that we wanted to get at this idea that whether voters perceived that the promises were kept. We thought that maybe was more important in terms of our theory about how voters are incorporating information. And so that's the measure we went by. But the actual boring part of all of this is that those two are super correlated. So it's the same whether we use the actual measure versus the real measure. And partly because these are relatively small villages. And so, if if the mayor is building an irrigation system, everybody knows about it. So there's a lot of, there's no sort of partisan differences in how they perceive the projects. The only difference are things like spatial distance. So if you live in the mountains, maybe you didn't see the irrigation project, or maybe you didn't know that there's a new childcare co-op. But that's the only thing that differs across respondents. But there was no sort of sense that they were over-crediting some or under-crediting some based on their view towards the mayors. And also because we had a measure of sort of general politician support, so we could sort of check that this wasn't happening. But yeah, so we do have two different measures of the kept promises. We have a real one, and we have a whether voters think it matters one. Like I said, we spent a lot of time theoretically arguing about them, about which one was the correct way to go given our model. And then at the end of the day, we're like, oh, it's just identical results essentially. So, but I feel like that's the story of measurement,
Thank you. Henry. We don't hear you. Oh,
now you hear me. This is really very interesting, and I'm always happy to see research that actually might have some kind of application where you could actually take what you've learned and perhaps apply it in a way that would change people's lives a little bit. The other part of it is it's very hard for me to conceive of local politics that are, in a sense, pure local politics. For example, and if I have a specific question, yes, the local people spend the money, but where do they get the money? There's no taxation element in any of your issues, I presume, in any of your measurements. So the money must come from the central government. Is that right?
That's right, exactly. And I think that was what made this possible in the first place, right? I think with the minute you have taxation, you have that extra element of sort of accountability and visibility to voters. Whereas in our case, the actual local source revenue that they get from their own people in the municipality, their own constituents, is very low. The bulk of it does indeed come from the national government, which is also why I think sometimes these politicians have this view that like it's magic. It comes from, they just spend a budget without thinking. It's probably partially due to this dynamic as well. The money is allocated by formula based on population of the municipalities.
So the second part of that, which I guess follows from this, is that how you feel about central government politics in no way is going to influence how you feel about these particular issues. From outside, we know nothing about Philippine villages, but we tend to know a lot about Duterte and the kind of issues. So maybe none of that filters down into local decision making. Is that what you're saying?
So that's what I would have told you before Duterte was elected. I think I would have been pretty confident in saying that, local politics is a very different animal than national politics in the Philippines. But for example, in the last election, when we did our surveys, that's when we saw much more Like we saw national level politics filtering down into the way that people are expressing their policy preferences at the local level. So things like Duterte is famous for his drug war and extrajudicial killings. And so we see much more people expressing preferences for things like, I forget the name of our categories, like peace and security is one of our sectors. And so I think there is this very fundamental change in Philippine politics that was ushered on by Duterte. Just that in this particular context, we don't see that yet. You know, like if you had asked 2016 Cesi this question, I would have been very confident to tell you that I didn't think there was much, you know, sort of filtering down of national politics. But we're seeing it more and more now. And I think it's just one of the things that's going to continue moving forward.
I thought, just on that note, I found it incredible that they would take a picture with Imelda, who hasn't been around, what, for 20 years in terms of any kind of involvement, you know?
It's incredible in these areas. We would talk to people and they said, well, you know, the Marcos regime, we heard there might have been some human rights abuses, but you know, we got this new highway. Like it's really like this complete disconnect. And so they're really so well loved there still, even now. But I guess that's what happens if you steal billions from the treasury and a big chunk of it goes to your hometown.
But also to your shoes and to your clothes.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Anyway, it's very interesting what you've done.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ceci. Perhaps I would have just a couple of small questions myself. First, you indicated that there was the incumbent and the top runner, I guess. Were there many instances where there were many candidates? Were there instances where there was no incumbent? And finally, the voting rule. You haven't mentioned the voting rule. I suppose it's first past the post. So if it's first past the post, do your results, if in fact, indicate that the system is working well, that, you know, basically the candidates, you know, basically are looking for the median voter? So this is a positive results for first past the post?
Yeah, well, first you're right. I feel like maybe, you know, it's like I realized it hit me. I spent too much time in the econ department because I forgot to mention the voting rules for these places, which I normally would in giving the background. But yes, they are indeed first past the post. You don't normally see a ton of candidates. I think the most that we've seen was 4 across the 2 elections. But the 4th is, I mean, kind of a nonsense candidate. I don't even know that he got much in the way of votes. But we always see we excluded uncontested places. So there are municipalities where the incumbent is running uncontested, usually correlated with things like coercion and violence as well. You know, the places where the drug lords are, or the people who have private armies. So those places are uncontested. But then so our sample is just the ones where the incumbent had at least one challenger.
But no incumbent at all?
Is there one with no incumbent? There are some with no incumbent, but because it's the Philippines, we code as incumbent the times when they have a placeholder. So this is the prime example of trying to do institutional rules to fix problems and then politicians coming around them. So the Philippines thought that to get rid of political dynasties, they would institute term limits. And so what ends up happening is that mayors, after their term is up, would have their wife or son take their spot, and then they would run again, right? So this is like, you know, they put a Band-Aid on the problem, which actually made things worse because then they're giving experience to the other family. Anyway, so that's what was happening. So we actually, I should have been more clear, but when we say incumbent, we mean incumbent or placeholder in that case. And there were a few of those. We did check to make sure that there was no separate effect. The only difference is that with some of the placeholders, we worried that, you know, that they just the inexperience of running, there would be something funny. So we did a few where we excluded the ones where the incumbents are placeholders, but the results are the same.
Thanks a lot. Any last question? if not, you know, I really want to thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. This is really, really amazing, fascinating, and we really loved it. And Wim, I think we have a special gift for our presenters. So I think, I don't know whether, Wim, you can show what is going to, I guess, to come to your place, whatever, pretty soon. Wim, can you show something or not?
Yes, that's
Oh, I love it.
I will email you on the weekend to ask you for your address, where to send it.
I love it. Thank you. It'll go along with my collection of McGill mugs downstairs.
Thanks a lot again. This was really, really extremely interesting.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ceci. That was amazing.